Welcome back to The Cellar. In 1961, America was at the height of the Cold War. Scientists were working day in and day out in order to find better ways to harness nuclear power. This story takes place in Idaho, one of the only places at the time where nuclear research and testing was focused solely on energy generation and not for weaponizing purposes. The SL-1 reactor was an experimental model that was used by the U.S. Army for research purposes. In fact, it was one of 52 testing reactors that had been built on a site just outside of Idaho Falls. It was January 3, 1961. 3 military men arrived at the site of the SL-1 reactor at 9 p.m. 26-year-old Navy Seabee Richard Legg, along with Army Specialist John Burns, age 22, and Richard McKinley, age 27, would begin their preparations to restart the reactor after an 11-day maintenance shutdown had just been completed. From all reports, the process of restarting the reactor was a gradual one, and all appeared to be going smoothly until John Burns made a critical error. John placed his hand on the main control rod and began to remove it from the reactor core. The mistake that was made was that he removed it too quickly and pulled it too far out of the reactor. This error would cause a catastrophic chain reaction. The SL-1 reactor would quickly exceed full operation and went critical. This caused the water around the reactor to flash boil. The force of the steam expanding within would lift the entire reactor itself into the air about 2.77 meters or 9 feet 1 inches. Many components of the reactor were thrown out of the top, one of which would proceed to impale Richard Legg. His body would be lifted up from a catwalk. He would penetrate the ceiling and be left dangling from up above. During the brief moment the reactor was airborne, radioactive steam would escape all around. It would begin spraying the room, and John Burns was so badly burned he would instantly die at the scene. Richard McKinley would end up suffering a head wound and sadly would end up dying a few hours later because of this injury. All 3 men's bodies would be left highly radioactive after the accident. With a fear of contamination present, the military made the decision to bury the men in a graveyard less than a mile from the scene of the explosion. There, they would be encased in lead coffins. The bodies, still to this day, rest in the same spot that they did way back in 1961. In fact, the Environmental Protection Agency still monitors the graveyard to ensure no radioactive contamination has occurred over the years. These 3 brave soldiers' remains are the only documented human beings to ever be killed by a reactor explosion within the United States. May their souls rest in peace, and may they always be remembered for their heroism and sacrifice. Alan Fish was a 14-year-old boy who absolutely loved baseball. In fact, he was the starting pitcher for his Little League team. On top of playing baseball, Alan would give anything to go and see the Los Angeles Dodgers play. So on May 16, 1970, Alan got that chance. Alan, his brother, and 5 other boys were all seated on the second row along the first baseline at Dodger Stadium. The weather was perfect, and the first 2 innings of the game went by with no issues. That was until they reached the bottom of the 3rd inning. Dodger outfielder Manny Mota would step up to bat. The pitch would be thrown, and Mota would connect and send a foul ball screaming into the stands. This foul ball would direct itself straight at Alan Fish, striking Alan square in his left temple. In that moment, Alan would lose complete consciousness. Around a minute or so later, Alan would come to and begin to groan and speak unintelligibly. Attendants at the park would soon escort Alan to the stadium's first aid station. At the station, Dr. Glenn E. Jones, the head of the stadium's emergency medical facility, was waiting to check Alan over. After looking the boy over for a couple of minutes, the doctor would determine that Alan was okay to resume watching the game. He gave the boy a couple aspirin, and Alan would return to his seat, seemingly no worse for wear. All would seem fine until Alan got home later that day. He began crying and shaking, and his speech problems appeared to return and worsen as time went by. Alan's parents would soon rush him to a nearby children's hospital where he would be looked over. From all accounts, he received some form of treatment. What that was exactly, I'm not certain. Sadly, Alan would not improve. In fact, he would end up suffering a convulsion the next night. This convulsion would leave Alan hanging on by a thread, and 2 days later, he would pass away at the hospital. Following the tragic passing of Alan, an autopsy would be done. The result of the autopsy would show that Alan had suffered a hairline fracture in his skull. This fracture would end up causing an intracerebral hemorrhage within Alan's brain. The parents of Alan were devastated after the death of their child. In the aftermath, a lawsuit would be filed against Dr. Jones, among others. In the lawsuit, the parents claimed that the doctor had been negligent by not immediately immobilizing Alan. If he had been immobilized, it would have allowed the hemorrhage to heal on its own. The case would eventually go to trial, where Dr. Jones would state that the doctors at the children's hospital could have contained Alan's hemorrhage with surgery, and that their failure to do so, not Dr. Jones's actions, caused Alan's death. Alan's parents would respond to this argument and actively sought a jury instruction that the children's hospital doctor's conduct was legally irrelevant. Ultimately, the trial court would refuse this request, and the jury would rule in favor of Dr. Jones. No matter where the fault lies, the dangers that are present at sporting events are always there. In particular, the dangers of errant balls and broken pieces of bats at baseball games. Over the years, steps have been made to help prevent these issues, but it is my belief that not enough has ever been done to make sure a death like this one never occurs again. At the end of the day, a young life was extinguished far too soon by a means that all but could have been completely prevented. Now, this next story is a two-in-one tale. Both of these women suffered very similar fates. Lourdes Maria da Silva was a woman who lived in Caxias do Sul, Brazil. Caxias do Sul is a town that is located within southern Brazil, set in the hilly Serra Gaúcha region. This area is known for its fantastic winemaking and deep Italian cultural history. It was August of 1980, and Lourdes was busy getting things done around the house. Now, there aren't a ton of details about this story, but at some point, Lourdes would go into her kitchen and acquire a Pyrex glass container of some kind. With this container now in her hands, she would proceed to her staircase and begin her venture to the next floor of her home. Somewhere along the way, Lourdes would lose her footing. She would fall down the stairs, and in an effort to protect herself, she would throw her hands in front of her. With the Pyrex glass still in her hands, the container would make contact just before she did at the bottom of the staircase. The glass container would shatter into numerous pieces just as Lourdes would land straight on top of it. Lourdes would find her bearings at the bottom of the stairs, but it would only take a moment before she knew something was horribly wrong. When the Pyrex container broke, it created numerous razor-sharp shards. Lourdes would feel a stinging pain in her neck, and as she grasped at the area, she would find one of those shards lodged in her neck. Without thinking it over, she would pull the glass out, and immediately, blood would begin to evacuate her body. Lourdes would manage to phone for help, and an ambulance would arrive to take her to the hospital. But sadly, before even making it to the hospital, Lourdes would bleed out. The piece of glass that had lodged itself in her neck had cut straight through a major artery, and Lourdes would have needed a miracle to have survived such a catastrophic injury. Now, this next story involves a 58-year-old California woman named Deborah Bedard. It was late in the day on June 7, 2017, and Deborah and her 17-year partner, Richard Clark, were enjoying a ride around their orchard in a golf cart. From all reports, Deborah and Richard would do this quite often, and this day was just like so many others that had come and gone before. Richard was driving the golf cart, and Deborah was sitting right beside him. In her hands were 2 glasses of wine. One was hers, and one was Richard's. As they continued their drive around the property, Richard would make a sudden left-hand turn. Unprepared for the quick action, Deborah would lose her balance in the golf cart. With both her hands unavailable to grab onto anything, Deborah would end up being ejected out of the golf cart head first. Both glasses of wine would shatter in Deborah's hands as she crumpled into the ground before her. Richard would immediately stop the golf cart and rush to Deborah's aid, and emergency services would end up being called. Now, it's unclear in all the reporting, but from what I can find, it appears the glass from the wine glasses may have either cut an artery in Deborah's wrist or cut an artery in Deborah's neck when she hit the ground. Either way, as a result of this, Deborah would end up losing a lot of blood, and rather quickly. Before emergency services could get her to a hospital, Deborah would succumb to these injuries. Both of these stories just go to show, once again, that seemingly normal, everyday things that we do bear the potential for tragedy to strike. It was July 4th, 1984, and a young 29-year-old lawyer named Reginald Tucker was enjoying himself at his company's 4th of July office party. Reginald was a promising young lawyer who had graduated with honors from Yale University and the University of Michigan Law School. According to all reports, he was a rising star within the Chicago legal community. Located at 130 East Randolph Street, Chicago, Illinois, the Schuyler, Roche, and Zwerner law firm was where Tucker was making his mark, working day in and day out as a trial lawyer. With years of grind behind Tucker, it was a welcome reprieve to be able to sit back and enjoy all the hard work with his fellow employees. The 4th of July party was hitting its stride within the 39th floor Prudential building. Everyone was enjoying themselves, and not a soul in the building could foresee the tragedy that was about to unfold before them. As the party continued on, a friendly argument would transpire between Tucker and one of his fellow colleagues. From all reports, the argument was about the Olympics, and that argument would soon boil over into a challenge. Both men decided they would settle their disagreement with a race down the 39th floor hallway. Tucker would soon be seen taking off his shoes and glasses, and before anyone could protest, the 2 men began their sprint down the hallway. Tucker would make it about 40 yards down the marble-floored corridor before fate would strike. Without his glasses, Tucker was virtually blind. So when Tucker slammed into a full-length plate glass window at the end of the corridor, he did so with a full head of steam. Onlookers at the nearby Grant Park firework display would stare on in horror as the glass would completely give way. With no way of stopping his forward momentum, Tucker would plunge some 600 feet down the side of the building to the unforgiving ground below. One onlooker stated that Tucker's body would impact a car that was parked, and he just exploded, while police later stated that portions of his body were scattered all around the street near the 41-story building in the city's downtown area. Friends of Tucker would later state that he had not been drinking and that alcohol in no way played a part in this tragedy. Gröna Lund is an amusement park in Stockholm, Sweden. The park is located on the seaward side of Djurgården Island and is considered to be relatively small compared to other amusement parks. This is mainly because of its central location, which ultimately limits its expansion efforts. Gröna Lund is Sweden's oldest amusement park, as it was initially founded in 1883 by a German man named Jakob Schultheis. Gröna Lund features most attractions that one would deem common to an amusement park. A tunnel of love, a funhouse, and 8 roller coasters are among the 31 attractions within the park. Gröna Lund is also known for its musical concerts. The capacity record is still held to this very day by the legend Bob Marley, who attracted 32,000 people back in 1980. From all reports, Gröna Lund has had an impeccable safety record over the course of its long and historic history. This leads us up to the fateful day of June 25th, 2023. The Jetline roller coaster opened in April of 1988. It is a clone of the Nightmare roller coaster at Camelot Theme Park in England. The roller coaster gained worldwide recognition for its curved lift hill, which is an anomaly amongst roller coasters. In 1997, the roller coaster went through some modifications in order to give it a longer, more steep first drop, while also adding a tunnel at the bottom of the first drop. To give you a full idea of how the ride works, the ride starts with a curved lift hill that carries the ride vehicle to a height of 32 meters or 105 feet. It then makes a right-handed turn which leads into the first drop. The drop goes down into a short tunnel and then makes a turn back towards the station and the rest of the ride. The vehicle then heads into a second drop. The ride itself hits a maximum G-force of 4.5 Gs at the bottom of the second drop. The rest of the ride is then composed of bank turns and helixes. The last helix leads into a tunnel and then back into the station. The total ride is roughly 1 minute and 30 seconds in length. On June 25, 2023, at around 11:28 a.m., 14 people boarded the Jetline roller coaster for a spin around its track. The coaster itself had been given a stamp of approval from an independent inspection company. Not only was it inspected at the beginning of the season, but it had been inspected again earlier that very month. Now, after digging beyond the headlines and newspapers, I feel I have a pretty decent idea of what happened, but I want to state that the investigation into the incident has not been officially completed as of today. But I did find a quote from someone who witnessed the accident in its entirety. Yasin Chowdhury, age 16, witnessed the accident as it transpired. He's quoted as saying, "We were about to ride a carousel when it happened. It was at quite a height. The coaster started making a lot of noise, and then suddenly the wheels started coming off. Then one person tumbled out, then another. After that, a third person fell out of their carriage. The third person managed to grab a hold of a beam as they fell." From statements and pictures, it appears the partial derailment of the coaster occurred with the front car. As you can see in the picture, it appears the front wheel assembly catastrophically failed. When it did, it appears the sudden force of the coaster coming to a stop then threw multiple riders out of their seats. From all reports, 3 riders were thrown from their seats. One of these riders tragically died, while the others suffered serious injury. One of the 3 riders thrown apparently landed on top of a beam, and you can see in this picture they managed to climb up and sit and wait for rescue from there. Ultimately, the investigation is still underway, but I did manage to dig even deeper and found numerous reports that were made by people at the park in the days leading up to this disaster. Someone who rode the roller coaster an hour and a half prior to the accident stated that the coaster was closed temporarily as they appeared to be making some sort of repairs. Another person who rode the coaster the day prior stated that the coaster stopped abruptly as it started on an uphill slope. According to this park visitor, They were forced to stay put for over 10 minutes as a technician was called to fix whatever the issue was at the time. If these reports are all true, then clearly something was going on with this roller coaster leading up to this terrible accident. Now, we need to wait until the full investigation has been completed, but ultimately, safety needs to be made a priority at all amusement parks across the world. Every time an accident occurs, it sparks a debate for more safety, but ultimately, all amusement park destinations need to stop with this approach. No one should have to die or suffer long-term injury before safety is treated as the number one priority. Located roughly 10 miles from the Belarus-Ukraine border and 62 miles north of the Ukrainian capital of Kiev, the Chernobyl nuclear power plant was first commissioned way back in 1977. It was an important milestone for the old Soviet Union. Within about a year of working on it, the first reactor that would supply energy to the power grid would be taken online. 7 years later, in 1984, a total of 4 reactors had commenced operation, with each one individually capable of producing 1,000 megawatts of electrical power. Just shy of 2 miles from the Chernobyl power plant lied the city of Pripyat. Pripyat was founded in 1970, and it took its namesake from a nearby river. The city of Pripyat was built solely to serve the power plant, and it had around 50,000 residents at the time of the incident we are discussing here today. Friday, April 25, 1986. Chernobyl's nuclear engineers would begin to lower the power at reactor number 4. This was being done in preparation for a safety test, which was meant to be conducted later that very evening. The test itself was being done in order to check whether the reactor turbines could continue powering emergency water coolant pumps in the event of a total power failure. Sadly, for all those involved with this test, it would become clear imminently that this was anything but safe. The test itself and everything that transpired has been looked over and analyzed with a fine-tooth comb. Right off the bat, it is clear that the test was poorly conceived, and even more so, terribly executed. What would transpire next would result in what many believe to be the worst man-made disaster the world has ever seen. The planned safety test called for shutting off the reactor's emergency core cooling system. This system provides water for cooling the core in an emergency. As the shutdown proceeded, the reactor was operating at around half power. This is when the electrical load dispatcher refused to allow any further shutdown. The why behind this is that ultimately the power was needed for the grid to remain operational. So about an hour goes by, and the team then turns off the emergency core cooling system. This was switched off while the reactor continued to operate at half power. At 2300 hours, the grid controller finally gave in and agreed to a further reduction in power. Now for this test, the reactor should have been stabilized at about 700 to 1000 megawatts thermal prior to the shutdown. But due to what's believed to be operational error, the power fell to about 30 megawatts thermal. It hit this low level at 0028 on the 26th of April. With the power being so low, the team then began an effort to increase the power back to where it needed to be for the test. As efforts were made to increase the power to the level originally planned, the team was met with increased difficulty. It is believed that a combination of xenon poisoning, reduced coolant void, and graphite cooldown thwarted the team's efforts. In order to compensate for the issues that were transpiring, the team then withdrew many of the control rods, which resulted in a violation of the minimum operating reactivity margin. To give some further context to this all, a positive void coefficient means that the reactivity increases as the void content inside the reactor increases. This is due to increased boiling or loss of coolant. To put this all as simply as I believe I understand it, as more control rods were removed from the reactor, more steam was created within the void that was now left within the reactor. At 0103, the reactor was stabilized at about 200 megawatts thermal. It was at this point that it was decided that the test would be carried out at this power level. The test would commence at 0123. The turbine stop valves were closed, and the 4 pumps powered by the slowing turbine started to run down. Now, I have read a few different reports as to what exactly went on next, and in what order it all transpired. I will continue to do my best to explain this as factually as possible, but based on my research, there are differing beliefs over what exactly transpired. Either way, there would suddenly be a runaway increase in power within the reactor. The team would panic and begin trying to reinsert the control rods, and at 012340, the scram button was pressed. This button is basically the emergency kill switch to the reactor. Now, based on reports, there are differing opinions as to what caused the runaway power surge. The best way I saw it broken down was via the World Nuclear Association's breakdown of events on their website. They stated, the slower flow rate, together with the entry to the core of slightly warmer feed water, may have caused boiling at the bottom of the core. This, along with xenon burnout, could have resulted in a runaway increase in power. An alternative view is that the power excursion was triggered by the insertion of the control rods after the scram button had already been pressed. No matter what order the events occurred, at 012347, the number 4 reactor at the Chernobyl power plant would explode. The first explosion is believed to have been the initial steam explosion, which was followed 2 or 3 seconds later by a second explosion. It is believed the second explosion was from the buildup of hydrogen due to zirconium steam reactions. The steam explosion blew off the steel and concrete lid of the reactor as the core suffered a partial meltdown. The explosion, along with the resulting fires within the power plant, would cause a release of at least 5% of the radioactive reactor core into the surrounding atmosphere. As wind picked up the radioactive materials, it would be spread to many parts of Europe over the next handful of days. Within moments of the explosion, firefighters would begin showing up on scene with only one thing on their mind, and that was to do their job and put out the fires and save as many lives as possible. Sadly, these brave souls had no proper protective clothing. Many of them would become exposed to large amounts of radioactive materials, causing most to perish in the coming months from acute radiation syndrome. Miraculously, though, by dawn, all the fires were suppressed except for the one within the reactor core itself. Subsequently, the other 3 reactors were shut down a short while later. The following day, after the initial explosion, officials would begin ordering helicopters to dump more than 5,000 tons of sand, lead, clay, and boron onto the burning reactor to help with extinguishing the fire within the core. It would then take nearly 36 hours before Soviet officials would finally begin evacuating the nearby city of Pripyat. The city's residents were completely in the dark and had no real understanding of the danger that was now invisibly in the air all around them. Residents would be advised to pack only necessities as they were loaded onto buses. Most residents left their homes believing that the evacuation was only going to be temporary. But sadly, none of these people would ever be allowed to return to their homes again. The Soviets would go to great lengths to try and cover up the catastrophic explosion. 48 hours after the event, most of the world still remained in the dark, but that would all change on the 28th of April, as a Swedish radiation monitoring station some 800 miles away would begin detecting high levels of radiation. With this news now being broadcast to the world, the Soviets finally were forced to make a statement. The Kremlin would go on to finally admit that yes, an accident had occurred at Chernobyl, but they assured the world that they had it all under control, but that ultimately wasn't the case. As days continued to pass, hundreds of workers would show up on site at the Chernobyl power plant. There they would risk their lives day in and day out in order to try and contain the radiation leak from Reactor 4's core. One of the most unbelievable forms of heroism was performed on May 4th, as 3 divers suited up and made their way through the pitch-black and flooded basement of Reactor 4. They did this in order to drain the bubbler pool sitting below the core. Ultimately, if they had not succeeded in doing so, the molten nuclear material above would have melted its way to those pools, and this would have resulted in a nuclear steam explosion, which would have wiped out the entire plant. The damage and nuclear fallout from something like that occurring may have left the entire world in a position where there was no coming back from it. Thousands more firefighters, miners, and soldiers would begin the long and painstakingly dangerous task of cleaning up. Around 600,000 to 800,000 of them would begin burying radioactive debris and topsoil, as well as shooting all wildlife within the 19-mile exclusion zone surrounding the power plant. Finally, by the end of the year, a giant concrete and steel structure known as the sarcophagus would be used to cover Reactor 4. This structure would help limit the radioactive contamination to the surrounding environment. In the aftermath of it all, the official reporting believes around 31 to 50 people died as a direct result of the disaster. But these numbers are hotly debated, as there's truly no way to know how many people were affected. But some do believe that upwards of 200 to 250,000 cancer deaths in Europe and 19,000 cancer deaths around the rest of the world can be attributed to the events that transpired at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. Now, I am sure most of us have watched someone we know suffer from cancer. The effects the disease has on a loved one is nothing short of being absolutely horrible. If it is true, then we already know that potentially hundreds of thousands of people suffered from cancer diagnoses after the Chernobyl disaster, while those that were directly exposed suffered the absolute worst. Those suffering acute radiation syndrome develop extreme nervousness and confusion, severe nausea, vomiting, and watery diarrhea, loss of consciousness, and burning sensations on the skin. Onset can occur within minutes of exposure, while its lasting effects can be anywhere from minutes to hours to days, with some making a partial recovery and others not being so lucky. Those exposed directly at Chernobyl, in no small way, suffered immensely. The exclusion zone around Chernobyl would also be extended to cover a roughly 1,000 square mile radius and was deemed uninhabitable for upwards of 20,000 years. At the end of the day, the Chernobyl incident has gone down as the world's worst nuclear disaster. The reactor released over 400 times as much radioactive material as the Hiroshima atomic bomb. This high exposure to ionizing radiation caused direct damage to DNA, resulting in cancers and genetic mutations that can be transmitted to future generations. As we continue into the future, humans need to realize that this world we live in is precious. There have already been numerous occurrences that have brought us to the precipice of total annihilation. If we aren't careful moving forward, the next one could be the one that shoves humanity straight off the cliff's edge. And with all that said, thank you all for tuning in to another episode. If you enjoy the content, please hit the like and subscribe button. It helps the channel continue to grow. Also, you can check the description box below and find the link to my merch store. Tons of awesome designs, and the proceeds help fund the channel. I also started a new membership tier for the channel. It's $2.99 a month and comes with some pretty cool perks. So if that interests any of you, then please go ahead and check it out. Also, if you'd like to submit a real-life scary story that you would like featured on an episode on the channel, please do so using the email linked in the description box below. As always, I do all the research, writing, recording, and editing for the channel myself, so anything you do to support the channel is greatly appreciated. Until next time, I will see you all again as we head back into the cellar.